My name is Sarah Holloway. I'm 31 years old, and the cruelest thing my father ever handed me was the truth delivered in front of a room full of people who understood me far better than he ever bothered to. He pushed back his chair, rose to his feet, looked around at every face gathered there to celebrate me, and chose that exact moment to say the one thing a daughter should never have to hear from the man who raised her. The silence that followed was immediate, total, like someone had pressed a button and drained every molecule of sound from the air. Every set of eyes in that room shifted toward me at once. I remember placing my glass down on the table, carefully, deliberately. My hands looked calm from the outside. Inside, nothing was calm. Nothing was even close to calm. But I also remember a thought arriving with strange clarity, that this was the moment, that after years of quietly mopping up disasters I never created, after years of being relied on, just enough to stay and overlooked, just enough to dismiss, the truth had finally found itself an audience. I didn't fight back. I didn't demand an explanation. I didn't give that room the collapse they were likely preparing themselves to witness. I simply stood there, absorbed what had been said, and understood something in the same breath. There are moments in life that don't destroy you. They just make it impossible to keep pretending that the life you've been living was ever what you told yourself it was. I left before anyone could reach me, before the first hand could touch my shoulder or the first voice could call my name. By the following morning, my phone had accumulated dozens of missed calls and a flood of messages, and not one of them shifted a single thing inside me. But before I tell you what my father actually said and what unfolded after I walked through that door, I want to ask you something. What time is it where you're sitting right now? What city, what country, what corner of the world are you watching from? What's the weather doing outside your window? I genuinely want to know how far this story's capable of traveling. 9 months before that dinner, my life appeared perfectly respectable from the outside looking in. I lived by myself in a one-bedroom apartment in Denver, Colorado. I worked full-time as a patient services operations coordinator for a network of outpatient rehabilitation clinics. I paid every bill when it was due. My kitchen stayed clean. I knew how to arrange a week on paper so it looked like something manageable, even on the mornings when my body wasn't convinced at work. I coordinated staff schedules, chased down insurance authorizations, maintained provider availability, calendars, fielded supply chain issues, and intercepted the kind of administrative errors that become expansive problems if nobody addresses them before they compound. I was skilled at this because I had trained myself to notice the things that other people decided weren't worth noticing. The same instinct came home with me every evening. The difference was that at home, nobody referred to it as work. In my family, it was simply part of who I was. My father, Gerald Holloway, was a man who believed that calm delivery made any position correct. He never needed to raise his voice because the steadiness of his tone was intimidating enough on its own. He could reduce you with a single sentence and make you feel grateful he'd kept it short. My mother, Patricia Holloway, operated differently. She was warm in a way that made her difficult to challenge. She absorbed the sharpest edges of my father's words and handed them back to everyone else coated in something softer. She repackaged dismissal as care. She translated his judgments into concern so fluently that you sometimes didn't realize what had happened until you were already alone with it. My younger brother, Daniel Holloway, was 25 and moved through his adult years like someone who had quietly decided that the gap between his problems and their solutions would always be filled by a more responsible person. That person, without exception, was me. By January, I was tracking both of my parents' medical appointments, monitoring prescription refill schedules, signing in to 2 separate insurance portals when one of them locked out, and sending Daniel reminders about his vehicle registration, because he seemed to operate under the impression that deadlines were suggestions directed at other people. None of it arrived all at once. That was the part that made it so hard to name. Each task came separately, presenting itself as a small favor. Each one had a perfectly reasonable justification attached to it. I was organized, I was nearby, I was faster at solving these things than walking anyone else through them would ever be. A 10-minute phone call here, a forwarded email there, a reminder sent between meetings. A stop at the pharmacy on the way home because doing it myself was easier than the conversation explaining why I shouldn't have to. People talk about being used as though it always feels like an assault while it's happening. In my experience, it doesn't. It feels logical. It feels like you're simply the most efficient solution available. It feels like sidestepping unnecessary conflict with people who won't resolve things as cleanly as you can, so you handle it and move forward. And the pattern quietly becomes the architecture of your life. My friend Maya Chun was the one person who refused to let that architecture go unexamined. She had been my closest friend since I moved into that apartment, and she had a particular kind of honesty that walked right up to the edge of what you could comfortably absorb. She worked as a risk analyst for a financial services firm downtown, which meant her professional life was built around identifying problems inside systems that most people preferred to leave unchallenged. She approached my family the same way. Whenever I described some new errand I'd taken on from my parents, or another problem Daniel had wandered away from while I cleaned it up behind him, Maya didn't react with surprise. She responded with exhaustion on my behalf. She had spent enough time around my family to understand how each of them operated. My father's calm authority, my mother's practiced reframing, Daniel's dependable assumption that someone more attentive would cover whatever he forgot. What she struggled to understand was how automatically I rationalized all of it. I had a ready explanation for everything. My father came from a different generation. My mother's heart was in the right place. Daniel was still figuring things out. The insurance form was just easier if I handled it directly. It was only one phone call. It was just a login. Those explanations kept the surface of my life smooth. They also guaranteed that nothing beneath the surface ever shifted. I believed that being the reliable one protected me. What it actually did was make me indispensable in a way that served everyone but me. The people around me never had to grow more capable because my capabilities had expanded to cover the space where their growth should have been. There were evenings when I'd sit in the parking lot after leaving the office, both hands still wrapped around the steering wheel, and attempt to mentally sort my responsibilities from everyone else's, only to realize I'd blended them together again so thoroughly I couldn't see the seam. I'd drive to Sunday dinner with grocery items in the passenger seat. Because my mother had forgotten to pick up two things, I'd spend 30 minutes of my commute listening to my father describe a letter from his insurance company as if it were written in some ancient language only I could decode. I'd pull into my apartment building at 9 o'clock feeling like I had spent the entire day maintaining systems I had no stake in. From the outside, I was a woman with a career and a family. From the inside, I was becoming invisible infrastructure, the structure that kept things running for people who had long since stopped registering that anyone was holding it up. The pattern showed itself most clearly at my parents' dinner table. They lived in a quiet subdivision on the eastern edge of Denver, the kind of neighborhood that looks comfortable and established from the curb. Inside the house, things operated on a single organizing principle. Whatever was working would continue, and whatever kept it working would be treated as a permanent feature of the landscape. By spring, Sunday dinners had settled back into their familial configuration. My mother cooked, my father occupied the head of the table as though the seat itself had been designed around him. Daniel arrived late, often enough that the lateness had become invisible, something everyone had quietly agreed not to address. I almost always came in carrying something. A prescription bag my mother had been meaning to collect for 3 days. A document my father had left unopened because there was no urgency until I was nearby. Some evenings I arrived empty-handed, which only meant the work had already been handled over the phone before I walked through the door. The first dinner that lodged itself in my memory began before we even sat down. My father had received a notice from his supplemental insurer. He had left it on the kitchen counter, sealed, for 3 days, on the logic that there was no point examining it until I could look at it with him. I stood at the island, read through the letter, called the provider line, and discovered that a billing code from a recent specialist visit had been entered incorrectly. It took about 30 minutes to trace the issue and one calendar reminder to ensure the correction was confirmed. By the time food reached the table, the problem was resolved. My mother passed the bread. Daniel described a vacation he couldn't realistically budget for. My father cut his meat and remarked that I had always had a knack for administrative matters. It wasn't a compliment, it was categorization. He didn't acknowledge that I had just saved him a dispute process that might have taken weeks. He described me the way someone describes a reliable appliance, not with gratitude, but with the mild satisfaction of something functioning as designed. My mother added that I had always been the practical one in the family. Daniel nodded in a way that made it obvious he hadn't been listening closely enough to know what he was agreeing with. I sat with the familiar sensation settling over me, the specific discomfort of being acknowledged for your function while being erased as a person. At the same moment, the second dinner arrived a few weeks later. I had just wrapped up a strong performance quarter at work. My regional director had specifically invited me to participate in a leadership planning review, not quite a promotion, but close enough to the shape of one that I allowed myself to feel genuinely proud for an evening. I mentioned it at dinner. I mentioned it because I had realized that staying quiet about every good thing happening in my own life was beginning to feel like a form of shrinking on purpose. My father put his fork down and asked whether taking on more responsibility at work might complicate the rest of my life. Not whether I had earned it, not whether I was proud of it. He wanted to know whether ambition might make me inconvenient. He said, with the measured tone he applied to everything, that ambition had a tendency to make people narrow. My mother redirected immediately. She said he was only expressing concern about balance. She could convert a dismissal into a gesture of care. So smoothly you almost missed the seam where one became the other. I looked at my plate and noticed that I wasn't even surprised. Daniel spent that same dinner airing his frustration about a late fee on his truck loan. He'd disregarded multiple reminders, missed the due date entirely, and was now directing his annoyance at the fee itself as though it were an arbitrary imposition rather than a consequence. Before the meal was finished, my mother suggested I could help him sort it out when I had a moment, because those kinds of websites were easier for me. Daniel didn't ask me directly. He didn't need to. The request moved across the table as something already decided. I said I'd take a look later. And as I said it, I could hear my own complicity in the pattern. Nobody had applied pressure. They had simply arranged the circumstances so that declining would feel like choosing coldness over family. After dinner, I sat in my car in their driveway with the engine off, watching the light above their garage burn against the door. I sat there long enough for the windshield to begin fogging at the edge. I was trying to understand why I walked out of that house every single week feeling smaller than when I'd walked in. But Maya had the clearest language for it. She came by my apartment 2 evenings later with takeout containers and no patience for comfortable answers. I walked her through the dinner, my father's comment, my mother's repackaging of it, Daniel's payment situation, the way every competency I brought into that house was immediately treated as a communal resource. Maya listened carefully. Then she said there was a meaningful difference between being someone people could count on and being someone who had been quietly consumed. She said my family had built their entire operating rhythm around my effort so thoroughly that the effort had stopped being visible, even to me. I wanted to push back because disagreeing would have preserved the version of things I was used to. Instead, I sat there with my food cooling in my lap and thought about how reliably my own plans dissolved the moment someone in that family misplaced something, forgot something, or decided something wasn't their problem yet. Maya said I kept framing it as patience because patience had dignity attached to it. Fear didn't. I didn't respond, but the longer I sat with that observation, the less space I had to move around it. The thing that finally broke the pattern open didn't happen at home. It happened at work. It was a Wednesday in early June, the kind of morning where small complications stack up before 8 o'clock and then compound every hour after. One of our therapists at the Highlands Ranch location had called out sick without coverage arranged. An intake packet for a new patient was missing 2 required signatures. A regional vendor had shipped the wrong equipment to not 1 but 2 clinic locations in the same week. By 9:00, I had already restructured 3 patient appointment blocks, resolved an authorization hold that would have delayed care for a post-surgical patient, and reconstructed the agenda for an operations review that I had spent 3 weeks developing from scratch. That meeting mattered. Our executive director was in the process of redistributing responsibilities across the network. And for the first time in my tenure, my name was being formally discussed as a candidate for a broader operations role, not a ceremonial title change. Real advancement, the kind that shifts your professional trajectory gradually and your compensation more noticeably. I had done the work that made my name part of that conversation. I had earned the right to be in that room. The review opened just after 11. I was seated in a glass-walled conference room with our regional director, 2 site managers, and the executive director joining remotely by video. My notes were organized. My location reports were printed. My staffing variance analysis was laid out beside my laptop in the order I intended to present it. 10 minutes in, my phone screen lit up with my mother's name. I declined the call. 2 minutes later, my father called. I sent it to voicemail without breaking the sentence I was in the middle of delivering. Then a message appeared from Daniel, not his usual clipped shorthand. A complete sentence, which was unusual enough that it registered as a signal. It read, "Dad needs you to call right now. It's about Mom." I stepped into the hallway, because that is what years of conditioning had trained me to do. Family emergencies had always been assigned a higher priority than whatever professional context I happened to be sitting inside. My father answered on the first ring. He explained that my mother had become confused at a specialist office about some referral paperwork. The front desk had told her something inconsistent with what she believed she'd been told at a previous appointment, and she needed someone to help clarify the situation. Nobody was injured. Nobody was in crisis. Nobody was in a hospital. It was a paperwork discrepancy. Bureaucratic confusion dressed up in the language of emergency, I told him. I was in the middle of a leadership meeting and asked whether it could wait an hour. He said the office was expecting an answer now. And then, in the same unhurried tone he used to deliver every opinion, he asked whether I really wanted my mother sitting in a waiting room feeling embarrassed because I was too occupied to help. Stood in that hallway underneath the framed corporate mission statement and felt something old and ugly slide into place inside my chest. I called the specialist office, discovered that the referral had been faxed to an incorrect number, an error made by a different provider's administrative staff. I relayed the correct information, then called my mother, settled her down, explained the situation, and sent a portal correction message to document the resolution. 18 minutes, that was the cost. When I returned to the conference room, the agenda had advanced without me. My regional director handed me a printed summary at the end of the session and said gently that I had missed the portion of the meeting covering role, distribution and expansion planning, but that she would find time to bring me up to speed. The kindness in her voice made it worse. A week later, she did bring me up to speed. The senior operations role had been awarded to a site manager who had fewer cross-location responsibilities than I did, less breadth of experience, but an unbroken record of remaining in the room when decisions were being made. She didn't frame it that way. She said I was valued, dependable, essential to the team's function. Organizations deploy those words when they want to retain your output without restructuring your future. I drove home that night with the windows sealed and the radio silent. When I told Maya what had happened, she went quiet for long enough to let the full weight of it settle. Then she asked me a question that no one in my family had ever thought to ask. What would your life actually look like if you stopped carving out space for them inside every moment that matters to you? I didn't have an immediate answer. The answer was too large and too structural to produce on the spot. It wasn't a scheduling adjustment. It wasn't a boundary. It was an entirely different life, one in which my time was mine by default, before it became anyone else's by claim. That night, I stopped wondering whether my family would eventually change. I started asking a more productive question, whether I was willing to. Before I went to sleep, I opened my laptop and updated my resume for the first time in 2 years. Then I opened a job search page, looked at the blank field, and let the blankness mean something new. Once I understood that leaving was a real option, everything sounded different. I didn't make any visible moves immediately. I activated job alerts in several cities I could picture myself inhabiting and started replying to recruiter emails during my lunch hour instead of deleting them. Denver had been the geography of my entire adult life. Leaving it felt both reckless and, strangely, entirely procedural, as if relocation were simply a series of logistical steps I hadn't arranged yet. The first interview was with a rehabilitation group outside Seattle. Nothing came from it. The second was with a healthcare organization in Albuquerque, closer to familiar territory than I wanted. The third arrived through a former vendor contact who had transitioned into administrative leadership at a specialty healthcare organization in Asheville, North Carolina. The scope of the role exceeded what I currently held. The compensation was better. The responsibilities were exactly what I had been slowly qualifying myself for across several years of work that someone else had been credited with. I took the interview call from the driver's seat of my car, parked behind our clinic during my lunch break. 2 rounds later, they requested references. 1 week after that, they sent an offer letter. I read the email 3 times before I typed my acceptance. That same evening, I opened apartment listings and located a 1-bedroom unit near downtown Asheville, within comfortable walking distance of a grocery store and less than 15 minutes from my future office. I submitted the rental application immediately before I had time to talk myself into running the decision through the emotional approval process my family had come to expect. Approval arrived within 2 days. I signed the lease at my kitchen table and then sat completely still for 1 full minute, not out of regret, but because the absence of regret felt significant enough to pause inside. Once the apartment existed, my birthday stopped feeling like a date on a calendar and started feeling like a departure point. I had already planned to keep the evening small that year, a private dining room at a downtown restaurant, surrounded by people I had chosen without obligation. After the lease, the gathering changed in meaning without changing in structure. It became the last thing I would host in Denver before I disappeared from the life people had built around my availability. I reserved a private room at a restaurant that understood quiet, intimate events, the kind of space where a conversation stays contained and the lighting flatters honesty. The guest list was deliberately narrow. Co-workers I trusted, Maya, 2 neighbors I had known since the first year in my building, a handful of friends who knew enough about my family to understand the difference between what was normal in that household and what was simply normalized. I invited my parents and Daniel, because declining to invite them would have transformed the evening into a different story, and I had no interest in handing them that kind of power. I wanted them present as guests, not as owners of the occasion. My father detected the change in dynamic almost immediately. He called the week after I placed the deposit and asked who else would be attending, not how many people, not whether I needed anything, specifically who. I told him it would mostly be colleagues and friends. He asked whether there would be speeches. I said it was dinner, not a program. He said that birthdays and family occasions typically called for a few words from the people who knew someone best. I let that sentence exist between us without confirming anything. My mother approached it differently. She asked whether she should bring floral arrangements, because she had a relationship with a florist who specialized in understated centerpieces. I told her the room didn't need supplementing. She said she only wanted to contribute something personal. The entire point of the evening was that it would belong to me without anyone else's fingerprints on it. Daniel participated in the way Daniel always did, by assuming the event would naturally expand to include whatever he wanted from it. He sent me a link to a bar in the same neighborhood and suggested we continue there afterward, as though the evening had been structured around him. I told him I had already planned the night. Maya asked at some point whether I was inviting them because I genuinely wanted them there, or because I wanted them to be present as witnesses. Both, I told her. I still carried some quiet hope that my family might manage a single evening without trying to reduce me back into the version of myself they found most useful. But a larger part of me wanted a room full of people who had known me in the life I had assembled outside of them in the weeks before my birthday. Every conversation with my parents carried an undercurrent I had to work to conceal. They didn't know I was leaving Colorado, but they could sense that something had shifted. Control has a sensitivity to distance that precedes any awareness of its cause. I kept moving through my days as if nothing was different, processing authorizations in the morning, reviewing clinic reports in the afternoon, then coming home to make lists that had nothing to do with my current city, packing supplies, utility account transfers, mail forwarding instructions, things that felt lighter once I stopped weighing whether I had permission to do them and simply started doing them. By the time the room filled in on my birthday, I already knew exactly who the night belonged to. I arrived early because people with my habits always do. The restaurant had arranged the private room beautifully, candles at a low, steady burn, a long table positioned near the windows, place settings spaced with enough generosity that nobody would have to perform warmth. They didn't feel. I confirmed the timing with the server. I stood alone for a moment looking at something I had organized entirely for myself. People arrived in ones and twos and settled the room just by walking into it. Colleagues from 2 different clinic locations, Maya in a deep green jacket, a retired couple from my floor who had watched me carry too many grocery bags home over the years and always offered to help, a former neighbor who brought wine and a card and told me 31 suited me. By the time the first drinks reached the table, the room had a warmth that my parents' house had never managed to produce. Nobody was monitoring anybody else's emotions. It was simply dinner shared between people who had chosen to be there, which made it feel almost radical. My family arrived last. My mother entered first, wearing the composed expression she reserved for occasions she considered worth the effort of being observed. My father followed with the scanning glance of a man assessing whether anyone present was relevant to him. Daniel came in behind them, already visibly restless, as though he'd walked into somewhere that might require his sustained attention for longer than was comfortable. I greeted them, introduced them to the people nearest the entrance, and watched the quiet shift register on my father's face when he understood that the room was not organized around family structure. No one deferred to him. No one rearranged themselves to accommodate his authority. He was not the center of anything in that space except my dwindling patience. For the first hour, that dynamic held. My colleagues asked about my work without framing it as a request for assistance. Maya watched me laugh at something and didn't intervene. Even the server seemed to read the room more accurately than my family did. Dinner moved the way dinner moves when no one is trying to control it. A therapist from one of our other locations told a story about a patient who had mistaken an aquatic treadmill for a luxury spa feature. Maya laughed at exactly the wrong moment in someone else's anecdote, which made the laughter spread further than the story had earned. Easy, uncomplicated conversation. My mother attempted to insert herself by asking guests how long they'd known me and then folding each answer into a smaller version of my history she could position herself inside. My father questioned 2 of my colleagues about trends in healthcare administration, as though he were evaluating whether they had sufficient knowledge to be in my company. Daniel spent half of the appetizer course examining his phone. I observed all of it. By the time entrees arrived, my father had grown noticeably quieter. I knew the difference between his casual silences and the kind of stillness that precedes something. This was the second kind. There is a particular quality of silence that accumulates around someone accustomed to being central, when they realize the room has stopped consulting them about their own presence. That was the quality building around my father by the time the dessert menus appeared. A small cake I had ordered arrived at the table. The room shifted into the gentle awkwardness that comes with being sung to by a group of adults. I blew out the single candle, thanked everyone, and returned to my seat. One of my colleagues raised a glass and offered a brief, warm toast about competence, steadiness, and the particular gift of people who make difficult days manageable for everyone around them. It should have ended there. The evening had found its natural close. Instead, my father set his fork down and stood up. He didn't smile, he didn't gesture for attention. He simply rose, as though the action required no justification and would face no resistance. Conversation dropped away in sections. My mother looked up at him with something close to alarm. Not enough to intervene, but enough to register that she knew. Ryan straightened in his seat. My father said he had spent the entire evening listening to people describe me as thoughtful, capable, generous, dependable. He said the room deserves something more honest than that. Then he looked directly at me, with the particular certainty of a man who had never once in his life second-guessed the timing of his own convictions, and said it was time I understood the truth, that they had never truly loved me, not in the way that parents were meant to love a daughter. Nobody moved. A server standing near the doorway with an empty tray seemed to forget that time was still passing. Maya's expression shifted in one clear, decisive moment. My mother fixed her gaze on the tablecloth. Daniel did nothing, which was, if I'm being accurate, the most honest contribution he'd made all evening. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. My chair made almost no sound as I rose. I said, "Thank you." And then I said, "That was everything I needed to hear." I retrieved my coat from the back of my chair and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. No hand reached out. The hallway beyond The room was silent in a completely different way from the silence I had just left, and by the time the cold air outside reached my face, I understood something with total clarity. He hadn't ruined the evening. He had resolved the argument I had been having with myself for the better part of a decade. By morning, my phone looked like it had been working without rest since the moment I left. I was on Maya's couch, a blanket wrapped around my legs, my coat draped over the arm of the chair across from me where I had dropped it after she opened the door, and asked nothing. I wasn't ready to answer. When I opened my eyes, the screen was a catalog of overnight activity. 34 missed calls, 91 unread messages, most from my parents, several from Daniel, a cluster from extended family members who had received partial information and were now operating on concern without context. 2 from co-workers, one from a colleague named Christine Nakamura, who had been sitting close enough to my father when he stood up to have seen his face before he opened his mouth. I didn't open any of it right away. Maya came out, registered my expression, and placed a coffee mug in front of me without comment. Then she told me what had happened after I left. My father had remained on his feet for several seconds after I walked out, as though he anticipated the room would reorganize itself in his direction. It did not. Christine was the first person to say, she told him, in a level and deliberate voice, that he had just publicly humiliated his daughter at a gathering, assembled specifically to celebrate her. My mother attempted to reframe the moment as one of emotional escalation. No one accepted the reframe. Daniel studied the table. The room emptied in increments after that. I listened to the account without asking her to stop or slow down. Somehow, hearing it didn't amplify the pain. It diminished it. The worst of it had already occurred, and I had already walked through it and out the other side. Around midday, I listened to one voicemail from my father. His tone was composed. He said the evening had become unfortunate and that family matters of this nature should not have been visible to people outside the family. Even in that message, his concern was not directed at what he had said. It was directed at the fact that others had been present when he said it. I diluted the message. An hour later, my Aunt Carolyn called. She was my father's older sister, and she was one of the few people in that family who had spent enough years in proximity to him to recognize the shape of cruelty. Even when it arrived in a reasonable tone of voice, she didn't encourage me to reconsider anything or return any calls. She said what had been stated at that dinner was not true. She said some people spend so many years mistaking control for love that they eventually lose the ability to tell the difference, and she said that leaving was sometimes the only truthful response available to the person who had spent the longest time staying. Her call was the first thing all day. That felt like something solid beneath my feet. I went home that afternoon, sat down at my kitchen table, and submitted my formal resignation. Then I updated my forwarding address, confirmed the lease documentation for Asheville, and began sorting through the parts of my life that were actually mine to take. Over the following week, I learned what it looks like when a family mistakes someone's presence for a service agreement. My father called twice, once about accessing an insurance portal, once about a password he no longer remembered. My mother sent a lengthy email covering misunderstanding, context, stress, tone, and the risks of making irreversible decisions in the immediate aftermath of an emotional experience. Daniel sent a text asking whether I still had contact information for the loan officer who had assisted him with his truck refinancing 2 years earlier. For the first time in years, I answered none of it. Their lives didn't fall apart. That wasn't what happened. What happened was smaller and more accurate. They had to manage their own affairs. Forms sat unread longer than they would have. Appointments were forgotten. A payment processed late. A prescription waited at the pharmacy for several days before anyone thought to collect it. Daniel had to resolve his own registration issue when the financial penalty for ignoring it became personally significant enough to motivate action. None of it was catastrophe. It was simply the ordinary weight of adult life, arriving without me to absorb it on their behalf. I moved 3 weeks later. Asheville was quieter than Denver in a way that felt immediately correct. The apartment was small, clean, and completely disconnected from anyone who had ever assumed my competence was something they were entitled to share. On my second morning there, I made coffee, opened only the emails that belonged to my new position, and stood in my own kitchen experiencing something I genuinely hadn't felt in years. Unclaimed. That is the word I return to most often. Not healed. Not triumphant. Unclaimed. If this story leaves anything with you, I hope it's this. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved. And being reliable is not a permanent agreement to disappear into other people's requirements. Some families don't fracture your heart in one visible break. They teach you, slowly, patiently, to hand pieces of it forward, and they name that process closeness. If you recognized yourself anywhere in this story, maybe the question isn't whether they'll eventually change. Maybe the question is how much longer you're willing to remain somewhere that measures your worth entirely by what you're willing to carry. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If something in here stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me which part landed hardest.